So we're very proud to work with Equimundo on hosting tonight's program, Who Cares About Fathers? The focus on healthy expressions of masculinity should be of interest to all of us, even to librarians. I can cite a number of studies that address the worrying decline in men's reading habits, especially longer works of fiction. These same studies connect a decline in reading with negative health outcomes for men, even when adjusting for education and wealth. It also correlates with a decline in men's ability to feel empathy, something that should really worry us all. And it's ultimately just bad for business when you don't read books, male or female. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Gary Barker, who is the CEO of Equimundo Center for Masculinities and Social Justice. Gary has been a global voice in engaging men and boys in advancing gender equality, gender justice, and positive masculinities for 3 decades. His list of accomplishments is long, I should say, but I do think it appropriate to mention, in light of our library setting tonight, that he is also a renowned novelist, whose most recent book, The Museum of Lost Love, I cannot recommend highly enough, and it is available for checkout downstairs on the 3rd floor. We also have, for those of you with a DC library card, and if you don't have one and want to borrow one of those books outside the room here, just let me know. I know people who can help you get that book out the door. And I was also told to remind everyone to visit the booth outside of the auditorium on the 5th floor if you want to share a story of fatherhood or expressing care for someone. I think that's an important mechanism by which we capture stories for Equimundo. So with that, please, Gary, come on up.
I just saw my Goodreads ranking go up by about 50%, so yeah. So race after this to go check it out. Thank you, Rich, for the introduction. We're thrilled to have this conversation, be in this lovely space full of lots of meaning, and with so many colleagues who care so much about this topic. We asked, in asking this provocation of who cares about fathers, I think all of you know that we care about engaging men as fathers for the benefit of much more than men ourselves. We believe that engaging men as the caregivers that we should be is good for women, it's good for children, it's good for us as men ourselves, it's good for societies. Our provocation is about that, because part of the answer is we don't really care as much about care as we should in general. And so we come in with that conversation that this is good for all of us. The last years, if not decades, of women's rights advocates have been helping call out the worst of aspects of masculinities. And sometimes it's easy to stop at that. In the last years, toxic masculinity has become almost like it was one word run together. And we want to put that toxic to one bit of a side and say we will keep calling out men who cause harm. And we spend a lot of energy in this country making harmful ideas about manhood. And we believe that care is the antidote for that the calling men into what it is to be empathetic and caring and connected is what we don't do enough of. So this event is about that. And if you haven't seen already from the slides coming through, the individuals here, it's easy to think about that, fatherhood is a kind of a heteronormative model of mom, dad, and 2 kids sitting around a kitchen table eating whatever that we eat in the mornings, and that we all look like that. We want to call it just the diversity of men's care. So we want your stories in the booth. You'll also hear us talking about it as well. For us, men's caregiving is lots of stuff. It's a man who moves across state lines to care for his elderly dad. It is a man who, together with his male partner, cares for a disabled child. It is a man who cares with 3 other caregivers, an aunt, a mother, a grandmother in the household to help get 2 kids out the door in the morning, one who's adopted, one who's biological, and that list could go on. It's a father who migrates across countries to provide for financial security for his daughter, and we know some of those in the audience tonight as well. It's all those kinds of forms of male caregiving, and I think we don't do enough of telling that story, those stories, and that's what we want to do tonight and with some of our work in the space. I'm here as a father. Together with my Brazilian partner, we moved to Chicago and had a baby during the middle of some long winters. And she reminded me along the way, things you don't think about before, is that the US has no nationally guaranteed paid leave. So in the middle of that moment, as she's calling out this country, like what backwards country had I brought her to, figuring out how we could be caregivers and do this work, and how we figure this out. We continue to be the only wealthy country that has no nationally guaranteed paid leave. Thrilled to be here with folks like Vicky Szabo, who's been leading conversations. She's in the back over there, trying to make this, with lots of other voices here, to make that happen. Also very pleased that we live in this District of Columbia that has one of the most progressive parental leave legislation policies in town. And that lets me call out former council member David Grasso, who was instrumental and added his voice to that, and thankful for that, man. So why us, this organization with this funny name called Equimundo? We work internationally to try to promote healthy masculinities. We started 10 years ago a global campaign called MenCare, and I'll show you a short clip about that. And we've been inspired by a lot of the US work. So we're trying to promote a dialogue on it. And I want to show a 2-minute film that shows how we try to inspire this in some other parts of the world, and then we'll come back to this country.
Minha mãe, uma vez, quando ele bateu na porta, minha mãe abriu, ele estava alcoolizado, estava bêbado, e deu um soco. Tinha que mostrar que ele era homem.
بمجتمعنا بطبيعة الحال الرجل هو رأس المرأة، يعني هي الفكرة اللي موجودة، والمرأة هي تابعة للرجل.
mbese abanza kuvuga ati niba umwohereje ku ishuri kikaba ikindi kibazo, numva cya gikomere cyanjye kirazamutse.
පිරිමියාය මේම තමයි ඉන්න ඕනේ. ඒ කියන්නේ ගෑනුන්ගේ වැඩ කරන්න කොහොමත් අකමැත්තේනේ. ඒ වුණාට මට මම අම්බ කරලා දෙනවා. එයා ගෙදර ඉඳලා කරනවා. ඒ ඔක්කොම එයා බලාගයි.
Eu ficava dentro do meu quarto, digamos assim, trancadão. Isso aqui ninguém mexe. A partir daquele momento ali, eu vendo a história de cada um, aquilo ali me serviu para que eu pudesse ser curado daquilo.
මට ඉස්සරලාම පොඩ්ඩක් ලැජ්ජ වුණා. මේ මාස 3ෙම ගියා වගේ. වෙන එකක් මගේ තුල එඟට ආවා වගේ දැනුණා.
وبنتعاون مع بعضنا. وقتها هي بتكون أنا عندي شغل هي بتهتم أكتر، وقتها هي بتكون عندها شغل كمان أنا بهتم.
umukobwa we yimubuhe buryo nyamara n'umukobwa wanjye nkumva ni ibintu nawe bimushimye kuba yarahindutse bifite umusaruro ushimishije.
Essa ferramenta é poderosa diante de uma comunidade de transformação. Ela não vem de um monte, ela vem pingo, 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 então torna aquele rio forte.
These are some of the stories that inspired us to do this work. And in the last 6-7 months, we've been engaging with a lot of the leading groups doing work to promote engaged and support engaged fatherhood in the U.S. I want to call out Andrew Fryband, if you'll raise your hand. Andrew's reached out and interviewed many of you here and about probably 20-some folks in the U.S. who are doing work on this topic, to say, what could we do together to try to amplify the fantastic work you're already doing? And partly what we want to do is to tell different stories. There's a lot of stories told in this country about that are from a deficit lens. There's a lot of racist language about deadbeat dads. We want to look at really what needs to be in place that acknowledges the structural changes that we have to do to support all families and all men to be the caregivers they want to be. The folks that you'll hear from tonight have been part of our interviews. There's a postcard up on the table with a report that we're putting out there that says pretty simply, there's not enough attention to care in general in our country, and there's not enough attention to what we do to bring men into that. And part of what we want to do, you'll hear us saying a lot, is to change the narrative around this. We did a review earlier this year together with the Gina Davis Institute of looking at the stories of how fatherhood's told on television, of the shows that we most watched. And we watched a lot the last years during COVID. The shows that we most watch in the US, there's a lot of men's caregiving showing up, almost at equal numbers of women. But then we look at what men are doing, and we're mostly shown as abusive, harmful, emotionally distant, or woefully incompetent. Now, there are some men like that, but those aren't the stories that really tell that we want to get out there. So we invite you to take a look at the report. There's a lot that needs to be done, but the first thing we want to do is to hear from those who have been doing this work for so long and inspiring us. So I'm going to step off now, and we want to hear the amazing stories that all of you tonight represent. But before that, I get to introduce Kojo Namdi. Kojo's a voice in our community, been on WAMU for a fixture, man. Your voice is in the morning with us, on Fridays, on weekends. Many of you know that Kojo does the Politics Hour with Kojo Namdi now. Before that, he was doing the Evening Exchange, and really is a voice of so much that's happened here. Moved here from Guyana in the late 60s to stir up some trouble, as I understand it, and I don't think he's really stopped from what I've seen. And I know that Kojo will bring this up, he also cares deeply about this topic, and I know that as having been the single caregiver of his two twin sons and your journey in caregiving, I know this topic means more than just be here tonight on a rainy night, that you'll tell us your story as well. So Kojo, thank you for being here, and I now turn it over to this great group. And thanks again for coming.
Thank you so much, Gary, and thank you all, of course, for being here. I had, as Gary pointed out, been hosting the Kojo Namdi show on WAMU radio for the past, 25 years or so. And in April of 2021, and I don't know if it was a coincidence that it was on April 1st that I retired from that job, but ever since then I've been working on a part-time basis and hosting the Politics Hour on Fridays at WAMU. And because my focus is on politics, I suspect that's why former DC Council member David Grasso is here tonight, because once he showed up, I figured he's running again. That's why he came to see. But David and wife, thank you so much for gracing us with their presence. Of course, the people who we are really here to hear, so to speak, are the people who sit beside me on the podium. So allow me to introduce them individually. First, Sarah Vitti. Sarah Vitti is the Senior Manager of Culture Change at Caring Across Generations, an organization that's working to transform our country's care infrastructure policies and change the way our society thinks about and values caregiving. She builds strategies that harness the power of art, culture, and media to seed inclusive and authentic narratives of care and help people envision a world where caregiving is collective, visible, and valued. Sarah Vitti. Omari Maynard is an artist, activist, and educator. Before becoming a full-time creative, he worked in the field of sports and education for 20 plus years. I did see you jogging in that movie. In 2016, Omari and his life partner, Shamoni Gibson, started their own business, Art for Living, lifestyle and event planning business. Unfortunately, Shamoni transitioned on October 6, 2019, due to medical malpractice after giving birth to their second child. After the tragic and preventable death of his beloved partner, Omari and his mother-in-law, Shawnee Gibson, founded the Aria Foundation. Founded the Aria Foundation. The foundation seeks to support individuals, families, and communities who experience the devastating aftershock associated with maternal infant morbidity and mortality. Omari Maynard, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Kenneth Braswell has spent over 32 years in the service of family and community. A husband and father of 5, he created Fathers Incorporated in 2004 and serves as its chief executive officer. FI has also served as the prime contractor for HHS's National Responsible Fatherhood Clearinghouse. Throughout his career, he has managed over $74 million in fatherhood programming. Kenneth Braswell, thank you so much for joining us. Brian Anderson is a husband and father of 2 spirited daughters who keep him inspired and exhausted every day. In his professional life, he's been a social worker, community organizer, university chaplain, and interfaith leadership development consultant. As the co-founder and executive director of Fathering Together, he brings those experiences to empowering fathers to be agents for social change. Brian Anderson, thank you for being here. And Hector Sanchez Flores is a board member of the Equimundo and executive director of the National Compadres Network, NCN, where he leads the organization's work to promote methods that build upon the cultural and personal assets of people and communities, especially for young men of color, to intervene and prevent violence, truancy, teen pregnancy, and other life-limiting outcomes for children, teens, and their families. Hector Sanchez Flores, thank you for being here. Okay, I'll start with you, Brian Anderson. Tell us about how Fathering Together came about and what you're learning from fathers in your outreach to them.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you all for being here tonight. Like most things, Fathering Together is the brainchild of a couple beers and a couple dads getting together and figuring out how to progress together. I'm the first of many of my friends to have children, and so I looked around and I didn't have many peers. I had my dad, my grandfather, I had my father-in-law who I had a good relationship with, but no one my age to journey through fatherhood with. And so I looked at some neighbors and I said, hey, let's meet at this bar and talk about fatherhood. I could use some advice. And that was about 6 years ago. And ever since, it's been slowly evolving into what it is today as a nonprofit. But the other piece of this is a Facebook group that my friend Chris Lewis started called Dads with Daughters. He just started it, invited a bunch of us bloggers to say, hey, let's share our thoughts together. And within a year, we had 10,000 members, and a year later, we had 125,000 members. And that growth got me thinking as a social community organizer that there's something here that needs to be talked about. And so we founded Fathering Together as a nonprofit to bring resources in, to help dads find those skills that they need, because so many would join and share their deepest, darkest fears of becoming a dad. And a lot of that stemmed from the fact that they just didn't know how to navigate it. They didn't have the skills. They weren't taught as a young person how to become a better father. And so I said, they're out there. These skills are out there. This is not something that hasn't been figured out for 10, 20,000 years. Let's help these dads out. And we started Fathering Together to do that. And we call ourselves Fathering Together because we wanted to do just that. Fatherhood is not a solo journey. I've never done anything by myself that's worth a darn. Everything I've tried on my own fails. I've always needed someone to help me critique to make it stronger, and fatherhood is the same way. And so Fathering Together now is something that we do that in the school systems, piloting these chapters in person where dads can come together and do it for the sake of their children to become better and be agents for their communities, not just for themselves.
Where is Fathering Together based, and when again did you start it?
Yeah, so I am based in Evanston, but because we started out as a Facebook group, we were global from the get-go. And right now, though, with our school-based chapters that John Badalament here, he's spearheading for us, it's only in the United States that we're focused on. Well,
you're based in Evanston. Welcome to warm weather.
Yes, it's about 5 degrees warmer, so I really appreciate it. Thank you.
In Washington. Kenneth Braswell. Fathers Incorporated is the largest network working to support low-income fathers in the U.S. What are the biggest obstacles facing low-income fathers?
You know, when I first saw that question and I said we're the largest, I felt like a local radio station where every station is number one, right? And so I had to take a moment to get my head around, are we? Yeah, okay, I'll ride that today. But one of the things that, and thank you so much, Equimundo, for having me here to speak about fatherhood today. But I think, with respect to fathers in the U.S. and our biggest obstacles, I think the first one is access to comprehensive programming. I think that because the responsible fatherhood field is not part of the social work fabric, that we have not been integrated into how schools of social work, how funding, how government and all of those entities play into helping building the structure or the infrastructure of responsible fatherhood. And so you have vast areas of the country where fathers are and they have absolutely no access to programming that is focused directly on them. They have to go to other programs and seek help, or they have to go through their child support offices, which is a whole nother conversation. The second thing I think is an obstacle for many of our fathers across the country is when they do find those programs, that those programs are often not culturally relevant to the spaces that they're living in. And while all fathers in general can get the same services, there's these nuances and factors and impacts that impact fathers of color, particularly. We're in Atlanta, Georgia. And because we're in Atlanta, Georgia, our demographics look a particular way. 98% of the men that we serve are low-income fathers. And so there's this nuance that we have to deal with them because there's all of these other societal impacts that impact them differently than it impacts other dads. The last thing, COVID has had an impact on how we serve. And so there are some things that have leveled out, but then also got a little more complicated. So when we first started working with our dads, employment was the biggest issue for low-income fathers. Employment, finding a job is not an issue anymore for these dads. Advancing into higher paying jobs where they can make more money and not have to work 5 jobs is the issue now. So how do you work with fathers who are already working, already doing what it is we're asking them to do, but how do we find the training and the access to academia that allows them to better their conditions? And the last thing is mental health services. I'm really trying to find a way to begin to start thinking differently about how men are being fathers in the lives of their children and how to advance them in their own self-care areas so that they can take care of themselves as they take care of others.
Is that a particular challenge, finding the agencies that can help men deal with those mental health issues?
I think it is because as we operate the National Responsible Fatherhood Clearinghouse, the reality is it is a governmental project, and the government can only go so far. And so when you're trying to create an entity that allows you to go to a one-stop entity to find something, there are these parameters that the federal government just can't go over. And so there's these conditions. The conditions are you a viable 501c3? Do you have a board? Do you have this? And once you start asking a bunch of qualifiers, you begin to start eliminating people that can help you. And so what you have is you have governmental agencies that sit on our site that aren't fatherhood programs but offer fatherhood services. But you don't have the mom and pops in the local areas that are trying to do support groups, and they're trying to help with reentry, and they're trying to help with mental health and early childhood development. Those can't be found because there's no one repository of all of those entities, and that's what makes it difficult.
Okay, next up, let me see if I get this right. Sarah Vitti. Is that Italian enough for you?
It is, yes, that was perfect.
Sarah, there are 21 million caregivers in this country, male caregivers. How are we normalizing caregiving as something a man does?
It's a great question. So one thing I want to say is that the 21 million male caregivers represents family caregivers, not paid care workers. So that's a whole other conversation for another day as to why there aren't more men in the care work field. But as far as family caregivers go, I think it helps to sort of answer the question of why it's not normal, to set that context a little bit. Why isn't it normal for a man to take on family caregiving roles? And I think that I just want to name that we're dealing with very binary, Western, patriarchal, and colonized ideas of what it means to be a man. These notions of masculinity, and so normalizing care as a man and caring men means that we have to start breaking down and shifting the expectations of who is expected to take on this labor in the home and in our communities. and we have a cultural association in this country particularly that in the home, women are expected to do this. And then when it's paid, particularly Black women are expected to do this work because of our legacy with chattel slavery. And so this has led to the overall, systematic devaluation of care as a whole. And there are 53 million family caregivers in the country, so the fact that there are 21 million male caregivers means that 40% of 40% of family caregivers are men. So there are tons of men actually doing this, but there's no representation of that, no visibilization of that. And to Gary's mention of the study earlier with the Gina Davis Institute, we are starting to see more representation on screen and in storytelling and pop culture and media, but still those representations are fairly reserved to fathering and not an expanded idea of all the other care responsibilities that happen across the lifespan in families. So there are really few cultural models. And I think just to actually answer your question about how we normalize it, and we were actually just, a bunch of us were having this conversation out in the reception, is that we need to tell more stories. We need to reflect people's experiences back to them. If 40 million men in this country are family caregivers at home doing that work, we need to see that. Men need to see that. Men need to be invited into those conversations and have their experiences reflected back to them. And we need to open up space to have these dialogues and to make men feel safe to ask for support. Men tend to feel very isolated in these roles because of traditional notions of masculinity, and it's a sign of weakness to ask for help. And so the men who are caregiving often actually feel more isolated than women who are doing it. So tell more stories. I think we need representation, diverse and inclusive representation of the many ways that care exists and shows up in different communities. And then we need to amplify those stories and actually create space for dialogue. And I think there's gonna be a clip shown of an example. Last year, Caring Across Generations, our culture change team worked with Justin Baldoni, who has a brand called Man Enough, where he has a podcast and unpacks these notions of toxic masculinity and is working to redefine what it means to be a man. And we partnered with him and his production company to do this limited 5-part series called Man Enough to Care. And this is a short clip of just one of the episodes.
Can we get to that clip later, or do you want it to be shown now?
I think it's meant to be shown now or later. Okay, never mind.
Well, we'll get
I was confused.
to it later on. Well, I think it's being queued up now, so I think we can see the clip of, it's called Man Enough to Care. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right, roll it.
In cancer, there's not much you can do. And there were times where, I was in Cincinnati, my daughter was getting treated in Philadelphia. I would have to FaceTime her, watching her hair fall out, tubes hooked up to her. As soon as we hang up the phone, I would just break down and cry.
For me, this is really about learning, because I think that there's a lot of men that could benefit from really having a new understanding of what it means to be a caregiver.
Yeah, definitely.
We have generations and generations and generations of men teaching men that we have to be strong and tough and brave and impervious to pain and to not cry, because there's no crying in baseball or football.
Right.
So yeah, that was just a short segment. There's 5 of those episodes, and I think that it's a good example of what we're talking about when we talk about creating safe space for men to share their stories about caregiving and be vulnerable. And I think that leads to normalization.
Do you think that the proliferation of media today, especially electronic media and social media, can help to normalize the notion of men as caregivers?
I definitely do. Even just with this one series, which was only one project that we did, we had thousands of people engaging, many, many men who were commenting on episodes, taking part in our tweet chats that we were having as supplemental conversations building off of the episodes, who were saying, this is me, this is my experience, and had never actually openly said that before or even identified as a caregiver at all. And there were women who were commenting, calling out the men who are caregivers in their lives and honoring them. And it was really clear from a few different sort of digital campaigns that we ran around that series that people were really hungry for these conversations, and men particularly were really hungry for these conversations, and we just barely scratched the surface with that series.
Dr. Sanchez-Flores, how has the National Compadres Network used cultural understandings and groundings of fatherhood and family to build its programs and its advocacy?
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. So the when I was introduced to the National Compadres Network, I was a young newlywed. And so barely beginning in the formation of my nuclear family. I was part of a family, my parents, who raised me and sacrificed for their family. And I had only received messages about responsible ways of being a man through popular media, right? And so those popular media messages did not look like my father, definitely did not look like me, and in some instances devalued that. So when I came and was introduced to the National Compadres Network, I saw men that were working very hard at nurturing better relationships with the people that they said they loved, including their children, right? And those men looked like my father. I was going to mature to look like them. And it was the first time that I saw men working at building the muscle and the skill about how you could do this. And it was being done using the traditions that culturally we as Latino, as we now call Latinx the community, things that I recognized. Not just being a provider, although that's a strong aspect of what I was raised around, but being present and nurturing and caring for the children that are around us. So when Lucy and I embarked on starting a family a little over 20 years ago, I had seen reflections of what that was like. I don't believe that I was any different than any Latino men in the community. I just had the privilege of seeing other men that openly shared and candidly conversed about what was going well and what was the struggle that was going on. So I got a head start in that way. I believe that 90% of the men out there are struggling in that same way. So what we try to do in the work that we do is remind them of the blessings that they carry, that they've inherited. That doesn't mean that we haven't had struggles either, right? But how is it that you draw on those blessings about what it is that we want our families to be like and grow into, what we view as what a family looks like, and how we can be very expansive in that thinking so that we're not limited by maybe false messages that we received? And then more importantly, how is it that we pass on those values that our families want to pass on? And how is it that we build from there to look at the shadow side of maybe some traumas that our community has experienced that has been infused, and we think that's who we are, when in fact, that's just what the trauma has created, right? So that's what we attempt to do, is build on assets in those ways. Culturally rooted assets that people recognize that we have, so that it's not like we're learning something. The best thing that you have is like, I already knew that. I just didn't know it had a place here, right? That's the biggest gift that you could have, is that realizing that somebody has just exposed something that you already carried that is of use to your daughter or your son, right? So that's what the National Compadres Network does. On a systematic level, that's not the way people view our fathers. They wouldn't view my father in that way. They would look at him and say, he lacks the formal education. So we need to teach him how to be a better father. Or he's a Mexican man, so therefore he couldn't be a good father because of whatever I ascribe as what a Mexican man is. And we don't believe that. We believe that all people are sacred, and we carry that organic and deep belief of love for our families and our children. And how is it that we activate that not from a deficit perspective, Kenneth. I mean, I'm sure, Kenneth, you've seen many instances like, we got to teach these men and fill in the blank, right? As opposed to, these men are here because they want to be better fathers. Some of us want to be better partners, and some of us want to be better men. And how do we build from that organic belief that there's something there to build from, as opposed that somehow I possess the information to make you better, right? That's the antithesis of what the National Compadres Network does. We build from what you carry, and you carry it. Because if you succeed, it's your success. Because if you don't succeed, we're not going to get blamed for it, right? But we will walk with you. We will walk with you on this journey of building something better than we could have imagined.
How long has the National Compadres Network been in existence?
Only 33 years. And the National Compadres Network was built on men who came together to do something for their community, and discovered in that first convening that the most radical thing that they could do was heal from whatever they carried that had kept them from being the best men and fathers they could be, that was the most radical thing that they could do so that they could strengthen the relationships of the children and the families they have before they go do work in the community, right? That they were showing up more healed and less traumatized. So 33 years of working to infuse that thinking in our collective mindset.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like for you all to take a look at a bit of the trailer from Aftershock, now still playing on Hulu, by the way.
My daughter's story is loud, colorful, and artful. She was awake, aware, and active. And yet she still died.
After she gave birth, Shamani was complaining that she had really sharp chest pains.
The ambulance came. I'm telling them the symptoms. Is she on drugs? Next set of people come in. Is she on drugs?
They kept asking her mother, is she on any drugs?
I'm like, do y'all talk?
We waited a solid 12 hours.
She's gone.
Black women are 4 times more likely to die than their white counterparts with the same symptoms. Why is that?
This is a growing epidemic in our community.
Hundreds and thousands of men are going through this same situation.
Oh, you couldn't tell me that I wouldn't be there.
I've never lived in this house without her.
You just gotta keep pushing forward. I can't let Amber be another statistic.
I had a plan, I had it mapped out.
If these numbers were flipped around and white women were dying at the rate that black women are dying, it would be a national crisis.
We fight against maternal morbidity event by event in order to create change.
We can turn our pain into power and make something of this.
Shamani Gibson, we hear you, we see you.
I planned on spending a lifetime with Amber. I wanted to give her my life. This way, I'm still going to.
Sometimes
The revolution will be tweeted, Instagram, Facebook.
This fight is not over.
When black mothers die, there's a ripple effect. We call it aftershock.
Omari Mena, I have a question for you, but do you mind if I first tell you a story?
Of course.
I am 77 years old. When I was 37 years old, my wife and I had twin sons. They were 10 years old. One day she complained of having a headache. We lived right around the corner in Washington from Howard University Hospital. She walked into Howard University Hospital to see what she could get to take care of her headache. She never emerged. She died of an aneurysm on her brain, but she died because no coagulation study had been conducted, and she literally bled to death. So when I saw Aftershock, it really struck a particular nerve with me. And so I think, understand a little bit of what you have been going through. But you decided to take action. Can you talk about that? Can you talk a little bit about your collective journey seeking justice through legislation, medical accountability, community, and the power of art at the intersection of growing brotherhood of surviving Black fathers?
Yes, I can. Thank you for sharing that, too. Thank you for sharing that story with us. And good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody. Yes, good. I'm glad we're alive and out here and listening. All is well. I mean, you asked, that was a lot for the question. What I will say is that, you know, my journey, there's a lot of things. So as I'm listening to everybody speak, I'm just so grateful and thankful for you all, because honestly, like, creating better fathers, creating better people, there has to be a through line, right? And the through line in this panel is holding the space, right? Creating space for people to be people and learn, you know, learn from each other. We live in such a siloed society nowadays that, you know, we don't really look towards outside entities for help, you know, and it's so important that we do that. Only because I only know what I know. You know, I can't learn something else unless I'm taught it. And I can't be taught and exceed unless I fail at it. You know, so when you have all these things, you know, you need support, you need the people. You know, you need, gentlemen like the men that are up here on this panel, and also Sarah. And just also you all, you know, so just thank y'all for being and sharing space with us. So to get more in depth in the question, Shamani Gibson, she would be 34 years old in about 2 weeks. Her birthday is December 19th. And when she passed away, the crazy thing about our story is that Shamani's mother, Shawnee Gibson, has been in the maternal health space for almost over a decade. More specifically, the darker side of maternal health. So, you know, she holds a conference every year called the Motherwick Conference, and it's basically a support group for people to come in, share about stillbirths, about, you know, birth traumas, about maternal morbidity, and use the power of dance and song and conversation and workshop and art, you know, to help tell the stories and create the table for dialogue. You know, so Shamani and I would submit artwork for her events every year. And in the submission of her artwork, I would learn about stories and hear the women's stories and just think about how sad it was, but never thought that I would be on the other side of this story one day. You know, so when Shamani, after she gave birth and she started complaining about chest pains immediately, we knew that she could possibly be having a pulmonary embolism. And, you know, what ends up happening is that in our community, everybody, especially in New York City, everybody's overworked. Everything is about time management and getting you in and out and in and out. And because of that, we had a midwife, we had a doula, but at the same time, it's the same thing. Like, everybody stretched so thin that there were many different balls that were dropped. Unfortunately, you know, those balls dropping ended up in Shamani's demise. But, you know, what came out of it is community and the influx of community, because of the fact that, again, you know, we held space for so many people for so many different reasons for a long time. You know, it was reciprocated back to us tenfold. And, you know, we talk about, so I'm bringing all of this up because I'm on this stage for a very specific reason. So after Shamani passed, it's so crazy because thankfully in New York City, they just changed the paternity leave criteria for us to have, I want to say 3 months off. It was either 2 or 3 months. So on September 23rd, started my leave, right, with my child. Shamani passes 2 weeks later, so thankfully I was still able to be on leave and grieve. After the leave was over, I had one bereavement day, and I had to go back to work. And obviously that wasn't gonna happen. So I ended up taking another leave, and this was unpaid, right? But because I had family, because I had community, I had people around me to help support, I was able to get that time, right? So Sarah brings that up to your point, like and thank you for just changing legislation, because it's so important that fathers have the space to help be in community and help provide for their children. But during that time, I was able to create artwork. And the artwork that I created, a lot of it is what, I present or I'm just out here today showing, and a lot of it was based off of creating work for Shamani, but it was the incubus of creating my In Her Honor series. And my In Her Honor series is basically a series of bodies of works that I create and gift to families who have experienced maternal mortality. And so in the film, you can see me painting a lot of them. I'm up to about 25 pieces of art that I've been able to gift to families. Unfortunately, maternal mortality, specifically in the United States, 7 to 1,000 women pass away every year due to maternal mortality or maternal health issues. So if I created 2 paintings every year, every day, I still wouldn't be able to, to gift everybody, a piece. And I say that to say that the maternal mortality, maternal morbidity, the healthcare system in general is failing our BIPOC community in ways that are undescribable. So in my In Her Honor series, I'm able to tell the stories of these women so that we can understand that these are not just numbers, right? These are families. These are women who have, children themselves, who are aunts, who are sisters, who are mothers, who are beautiful people and did amazing things for the community. So in telling those stories and providing those bodies of work, I then in turn had a chance to speak to the fathers, right? And to Kenneth's point, when we talk about fathering, or men in general, we have this shield. It's a shield that has been created for generations and generations, but when you provide a piece of artwork of somebody who's passed, who you've genuinely loved, it breaks those shields down like instantaneously, and real conversations can happen, right? So then I started having conversations with fathers about, the traumas that they feel, and honestly, just being a listening ear and just holding the space, So when we talk about change and policy, and that'll be my next piece, it starts with having conversations. It starts with sharing stories. It starts with holding space, and it starts with taking all of these entities and then, giving it to somebody else. In my sense, it ended up being a film, which was amazing because it allowed for other dialogues to happen, for other conversations to be had, but for some fathers, it just doesn't work out that way, but because we're able to share these stories, now we can talk about legislation like the Omnibus Act, and how we have these 12 bills, basically. One has been passed. We're still trying to get the 11 bills passed. But creating policy around holding people who are accountable for saving and protecting our lives. So I try to bring it back as full circle as I can. Again, art, the power of art, the power of creativity, the power of conversation is what has kept us. When I say us, I'm talking about our ancestors sane for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And if we're not doing the same, then we're not doing, right by our ancestors in our society. So I ask everybody to create whatever it is, share your story, write a song, dance, draw, whatever it is, because that's the only way that you can really identify who you are.
And it seems to me that the power of community has played a significant role here, because you and your partner, Shamani, were already part of a fairly tight-knit family and community. Mm-hmm. And after her passing, it seems that that community not only came around, but that you and others worked to make sure that that community was a part of everything that you've done. How important has that been, and how important is that to you still?
That's the only reason why I'm here. Honestly, it's the only reason why I'm on this stage. I speak to fathers often, and their partner passes away. They have this baby that they don't know what to do with, everybody gives their condolences, they have the funeral, they have the repast, the next day they got to go back to work and nobody's there to support. You know, for me, I was able to take an entire year off of work before I, you know, had to go out and step away and be apart from my children. And even that, it happened during COVID. So thankfully, as a teacher, I was able to teach from home. But it gave me the opportunity or the insight to know, I was telling Hector this earlier, that my teaching salary was only enough to pay for my child's daycare. I couldn't pay for anything else. So rent, bills, all the other stuff, that was pretty much out the window. But, you know, having the chance to stay home, having the opportunity to create and understand what my power is and what my gifts were and how I was able to share it with the world would be that next step for me to take. So therefore, I fired my job last year and just started being an activist, an advocate, and creating artwork. But it can only have happened because of community. And we talked about Charles Johnson. Kenneth asked me about Charles Johnson. Charles Johnson lost his partner, Kara Johnson, I want to say about 5 or 6 years ago. Didn't know Charles Johnson from a hole in the wall, but he reached out to me through social media. I want to say maybe about a week after Shamani passed. It was Charles Johnson and another gentleman named Mustafa Shabazz. And we talked, and they were really the only two people that I could really express and share my feelings with and know that when I tell you that I'm in the darkest place I've ever been in my life, that they knew where that place was and they knew why, and all the other factors that I had to deal with in this outside world, you know. So understanding how important that support was to me made me feel like the only thing I could really do was pay it forward to somebody else. And that's how I met Bruce McIntyre and essentially the other men who I now form a collective with and we speak with, you know, on a continuous basis to just share our traumas.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Kenneth Braswell, can you talk a little bit about the National Responsible Fatherhood Clearinghouse, the NRFC, and the importance of its role in the fatherhood and caregiving space?
You know, it feels like such a trivial conversation after having to follow, you know, what Amari was just talking about. You know, because, you know, this work that we do, I tell people often that this is not hard work, this is heart work. And if your heart isn't in it, you can't do it. Step away from the mic, get away from the mic, because you're going to do more harm to someone than you are going to do help. You know, for our role in overseeing the National Responsible Fatherhood Clearinghouse over the last 12 years now, you know, we got this contract on faith of the work, right? Really, and I tell people the story, and they're like, what? I'm like, yeah. I was like, you know what? When we got the contract, I was doing my fatherhood work out of the basement of my house with my 3-year-old son banging above the basement, the wash machine and the dryer in the corner, cobwebs over my head, and mildew smell. That's where I was when we got this contract. And I had someone tell me when we were bidding for the contract that they would not let me fail, right? And so we walked into this work knowing that this wasn't a happenstance. This was part of my journey and destiny to kind of do this work on a national scale. And the beauty of the work is it gets me to know people like Brian and Sarah and Hector and Amari and hear your story, Kojo and Gary and others who are in the room. And I get to carry those stories with me and put those into the clearinghouse that's charged with really continuing to advance the conversation of responsible fatherhood throughout the country through mechanisms of creating media, creating products. We have a virtual community, we have an online website, we have a depository of research that has 4,500 items in it, just really taking the work of responsible fatherhood and trying to bring it into one space. The challenge with it over the last 12 years is just when someone says, man, how long does it take to get people to understand responsible fatherhood? Should it take 12 years to do that? one of the challenges that we've had is that we have to continue to reinvent ourselves because things keep changing so quickly. And I give you a couple of for instances. And so new people are coming into the space as we are encouraging folks to think more about responsible fatherhood. So you have other agencies like HRSA, right, who is now mandated it within the contracts of the entities that provide Healthy Start to now serve the fathers in their program. You have Head Start, who is now mandating Head Starts around the country to begin to focus on fatherhood within those programs. You have HUD, who is now beginning to look at policy, to look at how fathers are being impacted by housing policies across the country. All of these folks are coming to the space and they're brand new. They don't even know why they're in the space. A lot of these people are struggling because they're getting in the space and there's no formal infrastructure to even help them why you should be working with fathers in the first place. And then on top of that, they're bringing their own personal baggage into the space, right? And so when you're trying to talk to entities like social workers that are predominantly women, and you're talking to CEOs that run not-for-profits that are predominantly women, and they bring their own personal pieces into the space because of their own relationships or lack thereof with their own fathers or the fathers of their children, we got to climb over that in order to convince them that they should be in the space in the first place. And so those are some of the things that are shifting. One of the other things that's shifting in our work is technology. It's moving so quickly, it's hard to keep up with how you deliver the services. What does that look like? The pandemic for us forced us to stop doing our classes in person and go virtual. So everybody had to learn Zoom like this, right? Everybody had to learn Teams meetings like this. Everybody had to go virtual like this. So you're talking to communities where the infrastructure of internet, broadband, and those kinds of things were a problem for communities that did not have computers, and so they were isolated from services. You had to kind of figure out how to get into those spaces. And then the last space with respect to the clearinghouse that things are shifting is in this generational space. And that's a conversation that we got to have more of. The generalization aspect of responsible fatherhood is now leading us to see that there's a different way that you serve baby boomer dads and Gen Z dads. I got two Gen Zers in my house, a 13-year-old and a 14. And any of you have young teenagers, they are a different breed, right? They think differently about everything. And so when you're talking to them, and now the Gen Zers are now into children-bearing age, they're now 24, 25 years old, they are now graduating from college, they're moving out into the community, they have a whole different thought about parenting and what that looks like and the decisions that they make. And so they're not making traditional decisions. Oh, you're the woman, you had the baby, you got to keep the baby, I go to work. Now they're having conversations, which one of us are more capable of taking care of this child, right? We're not going to court. We're going to figure this thing out. And so when we start looking at caregiving, we really got to think differently from the clearinghouse's perspective. How do we begin to start having conversations around the importance of expanding our conversation beyond just fatherhood, but moving into the space of parenting and then caregiving? And so I told my testimony, and I'm going to end here in the booth, and you guys will see it somewhere else, but I'm going to say it here anyway because it's relevant. My wife and I had to care for my mother-in-law who had Alzheimer's disease and moving into dementia. My son at the time was about 3 years old. And so what I remembered about that time that she was in the house, that caring for her wasn't only a task of my wife, it was a household task, right? And so I had to be just as mindful as my wife's mental health as we were of caring for our mother, because I had to say to my wife every now and then, go get in the car and go do something. Take some time for 3 or 4 hours. We got this. And then secondly, I watched my 3-year-old son and his attentiveness to his grandmother where they sat on the couch together and watched TV together, right? Or played the piano, because she was a piano player. When she was coherent, she would sit him next to him and teach him how to play the piano. And it was then when I realized that caretaking is a family thing. The difficulty in having this conversation with the society, with men, is because society, it's hard to give something that society don't believe that we can do, which is care. Right? They don't believe we can care, so they don't believe we can give care. And we have to begin to start telling stories of men who are connected by caring through, not because of, there's a tragic story that happened in Atlanta last weekend where a father murdered his son, a baby, and then turned the gun on himself and didn't shoot the kid that was in the back seat over a domestic issue. And one of the comments that I made in a blog that I wrote was, you have to find a way not to hate someone more than you love someone. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Like, and you have to say to yourself, I'm not going to hate this person more than I love my children. My children are not going to be a sacrifice for how much I cannot get along with you now. And so in the caregiving space for the clearinghouse, it is trying to normalize conflict, right, for parents, so that they understand that it is a family paradigm, that it's not a solo act. We don't care alone, we care as a community. And where government plays a role and can play a role in supporting, financing, resourcing, those kinds of things, I think it's extremely important for things like the clearinghouse to do that. Where they should not be is in the space of directing who should be saying what to who. Sit back and support, give your resources support, but don't tell me how a family should look. Don't tell me what it looks like to take care of my community. Don't tell me what it looks like to do those things. If you stay away from this, take care of what you take care of, we'll take care of what we take care of.
One aspect of caregiving that you talked about really reminded me of something, because after my wife passed, my mother came to live with me to help with the kids and with me. And a few years after that, she started developing dementia and ultimately had Alzheimer's. Wow. And we ended up taking care of her. And I have a friend who is in the insurance business, and in a casual conversation, I asked him one day, do you have long-term care insurance? He said, no, I do not. I said, but you're in the insurance business. How come? He said, when your mother died, who was she living with? I said, me. He said, when my mother died, who was she living with? I said, you. He said, that's why I try to be a good father. Because ultimately, that's who will take care of me. And
I actually said that. Well, Sarah, as you and I talking, and I said, one day the diapers you change will be your own.
Exactly. Hector Sanchez Flores, I was glad when Kenneth Braswell referred to the generational aspect of it, because that's why I asked you initially how long the National Compatriots Network had been in existence, because you've been in existence for more than one generation. Yeah. From your experience, are there still existing policy gaps preventing the development of effective fatherhood and male involvement programs, especially for men of color?
So the short answer is yes, absolutely. If we were to ask a different question of policymakers, not of you, great question, is what are we trying to create here, right? And I would, in the conversations that we have, we want to make investments so that our children experience more blessings in their lives than struggles, right? And if we were to center that, what would we construct around our children to strengthen what mothers would benefit from? Better prenatal care, more attentive care, monitoring of that. And we do that. We say, we had this conversation before, we say that's important, but really the answer is for some, right? That's the honest answer. we should be saying the same thing about our work with fathers and men, both the ones that are actively parenting and trying to support their children with more blessings, but even younger children, so that they have a healthy concept of what a family looks like. Like, I remember working with young men, 13, 14, and I would ask them, and I only came to this realization because I worked with young women too at the time, and I would ask them, well, what kind of family do you envision? And they would tell me very vividly, I would like 3 children. I would prefer 2 girls and 1 boy. I would prefer all boys. I would prefer all girls, right? They had an active vision of what that would be like, right? And you would ask their counterparts of the same age, and development may lag for boys, but they would look at you like, what? And I would invite them to think about what kind of family they want to construct, if they want to have one, right? And for the first time, somebody was asking them how they envision their future. And many of them would envision a future with children. And then I would say, how do you want to construct the family around you and the children, right? And then they would come to like, oh, I would really like it to be like this. And sometimes it was unrealistic, but many times they were planting the seed of like what a partnership may look like for them, right? Now, it would be beautiful if society then said, let's build the supports that help you create your vision, right? If you want 1 child, if you don't want any child, if you want 2, if you want 10, whatever that would be, wouldn't it be wonderful if society would say, this is how we're going to support you, and the supports are real for them. My son asked me one time, he says, because at the time it was only him, I think we were expecting our 2nd child, my daughter Sophia, and he said to me, hey Dad, did you always want 2 children? And I said, no, Diego, I wanted 3, right? And he looks at it like, well, Mom says that we're only going to have 2. Why is that? And I said, and I said to him, I said, mijo, it's because once I decided that it was your mom that I wanted to construct a family with, I wanted to keep her. And so that's why we've decided, and I have agreed, that ideally 2 would be good for our family, right? And I think that plants a seed about the cooperation, about the dialogue about family formation. So I would like to see a stronger parental leave for both mothers and fathers, right? I would love to see quality daycare resources put in so that our children could benefit from the community that would nurture them, and hopefully that community would look like them, so the children would be looking up to caregivers that look like them and love them the way our families love our children. And ultimately, all of those things that help us say, not only me, that I love my children, but that my community wants and loves my children too. So the policies are such as, do I parent the same way as my wife, who happens to be a psychologist? Absolutely not. She's much better than I am, right? But I do learn from her, and I learn from others. And so how is it that we construct this dialogue of conversation like we have? We work closely with non-Latino serving organizations, and I have learned through those interactions and the relationships that I built with those men that fathering may look different, but they've utilized some tools and some skills that have made me a better father, right? So it always won't be people that look and reflect you, but if you are in a relationship with these individuals who also care for their children, I have grown and benefited from that. And policies should allow for that, right? Kenneth, I think you would be like, there's no template to fatherhood. Every family is different. There's some commonalities and some structures that we want to have, but how it actually looks may be drastically different from home to home. But if there's love for children and the family and the community, then that would help us inform policies. But I'm going to be very blunt. I'm not sure if systems love all our children the same, right? And so I would want policies that say all our children are sacred, not special. They're sacred. Because if we said that they were sacred, then we would only do things that would reinforce that sacredness, right? And children would respond drastically different than just somebody who says they're special. Yes, they're all special, and they all are going to learn to be unique, but they need people around them that says, you're sacred just the way you are, just the way you came into this world. There's nothing you need to do that's different. It's my job to adapt, to feed that sacredness, right? So that they could be their best version. And as a father, that would be the biggest gift that we could receive.
Well, I suspect our time is winding down, but I do have a few more questions that I'd like to ask. Brian Anderson, in your book, Fathering Together, Living a Connected Dad Life, you highlight a new narrative for fatherhood, one based in servant leadership that goes beyond the stereotypical role of breadwinner. What is the core message behind your idea of fatherhood as servant leadership and or act of service?
Yeah, thank you. So I was blessed to have a dad in the early 80s that broke the mold and wanted to be involved in my life. And he would always tell me he wants to be engaged because my grandfather was not an engaged dad. And the roots of servant leadership really played out in how my dad was engaged in the community, in our church, in my life. He's a carpenter, so he would build like sets for the musicals that I would either invent in our basement or later on in high school. But Robert Greenleaf back in the 60s wrote about servant leadership as a model for the corporate world. And there's like 16 different virtues that he lays out. And that's way too many. I have ADD, I can't handle 16. Most of us can't handle 16. So I really whittled it down. And the more I would talk with dads, they talk in terms of leadership in corporate life, and the ones that I would talk to anyway. And I would help them translate that into the home to say, okay, how are you improving and creating opportunities for your children, just like you're improving and creating opportunities for your staff? You want your staff to grow and develop and move on into different fields. Why aren't you doing that with your kids? Why aren't you creating opportunities for them to grow, learn, and make mistakes in art or sports instead of being absent and working 80 hours a week and then show up on the weekends or maybe make the big moments? One of the dads I interviewed, Andy, said that he had to perform to learn his dad's love. He was never there for the little moments at dinner unless it was after a sports game or if there was a musical or some sort of other event that he performed and earned, quote unquote, earned his dad's love. But in servant leadership, which there's countless books by corporate leaders about how they turn their businesses around, that's great. There were none on fatherhood that I could find. There's like 2 blogs, and I was like, okay, I got a lot of work here. But the interviews from Andy and other dads laid out the framework for me because Andy learned, like, it's just being there. It's being present. When your kid is really sick, all you can do is hold them sometimes and rock them in the rocking chair and find out that that's the best you could do and all you could do. It's creating opportunities and accepting your kid for who they are, not who you want them to be. My friend Matt has a child who's 7, not quite sure how he identifies yet, and on his 5th birthday wanted to wear his favorite dress, a Disney dress. And Matt said, okay, if that's what you want to wear for your birthday, it's your birthday. A mom came up and said, we have to leave. And he got really nervous. He's like, why are you leaving my son's party? And she said, well, my son wanted to wear a dress, and I didn't know if it was safe for him, so we're going to go get his dress and come back. And when Matt told me that, I was like, that needs to be shared across the world. Like, that is what servant leadership is. It's not holding your values front and center and dictating how your child needs to behave, but it's helping them learn their values and working with them to lift up their identity. And ultimately, as you've all shared, it's community, right? It's finding community and advocating. Or as I like to say, advocate for your child and then step out of the way and be an ally for them as they carry their voice forward. Mm-hmm. And that's a part of fatherhood that we don't really talk about as an act of service because it's just something we do. So many dads said, well, I'm a dad from like 5 to 7. We don't have a father mindset that says at 3:30 in the afternoon when I have a business call and then I get interrupted by a call from my kid, I take it. Right? No, the mom takes it, or the school will call the mom rather than the dad, even if the dad is the first on the go-to call list, right? And so as dads, how do we shift that narrative and build something new? Last thing I'll just say is I've been to many gender dynamics, gender-based violence workshops, trainings, conferences, and we'd love to deconstruct what's wrong. Like Gary was saying, toxic masculinity, it's everywhere. But we rarely build a new model for dads to take on. And so men are left with what's next. And as a white man, we're really vanilla. When you talk to white men, we don't identify with our identities, we talk about what we do. And boys learn that from us. And so how do we then create an act of love through service, through kindness, through caring for the people that we should be spending the most time with, and doing that through a servant leadership framework? And so that's what I lay out in the book.
I'm wondering if I can call up a clip that comes from Caring Across Generations. It's Man Enough to Care.
No, sorry. I messed you up because that was
the last one we
first
saw.
Yes.
Okay. But I still have another question for you, and that is, in relationship to that clip, how do we build a culture of care? Did I ask that question before?
No, you did not.
How do we build a culture of care where care is considered a strength and part of a newly expanded notion of masculinity?
Yeah, this is a big question. I think that, again, building a culture of care, whether it's for men, whether it's for all of us, requires us to, tell the stories, do the work of interjecting care narratives into, the cultural zeitgeist all around us, so that people can see that care is everywhere. Care is fundamentally the most universal thing that humans do. And at some point in our lives, we will need to be cared for. And we'll need to care for other people. And so representation is critical, and representation can also either reinforce stereotypes, whether it be around gender, whether it be around what family is supposed to be, what community is supposed to be, or they can disrupt and shift those norms and those narratives. To Brian's point and Hector's point about envisioning, right? Offering the vision of what that future looks like to people. And inviting people into that vision of what a future looks like that is centered on care, where care is seen as collective, it's understood as collective, our interdependence is understood, and where care is valued as labor. But I also think it requires us to zoom up and out a little bit, and it sort of starts with us, like I said, recognizing our interdependence. Because once we start to recognize, and I think actually the pandemic really lifted the veil in big, big ways, from off of this seminal American narrative of individualism and rugged individualism, and showed us how deeply connected we are. And so I think once we start to actually see that and recognize that, we're sort of challenged to interrogate all of these other norms and narratives that we've been indoctrinated with around individualism, around scarcity. There's not enough to go around, so we can't all have paid leave. We can't all have child care. We can't all have access to care in the home when we need it. Those things aren't true. They've been taught to us and indoctrinated within us because of capitalism and white supremacy and patriarchy and the world and the society that we live in here. And then I also think that we shouldn't necessarily even have to reorient care to be seen as something that that requires strength in order to bring men into the conversation. I actually. And a lot of the work that all of these men on this panel are doing is actually very rooted in heart and softness, right? And of course, in that is strength. But the idea that we have to reorient care and caregiving to be this thing that only strong people do in order for men to see themselves in it is kind of, it reinforces, again, those stereotypes. So I think we need to, what we're doing here today, bring men into this conversation. What Equimundo does is continue having these conversations with men so that we can start to break down those gender binaries. And then also, I think, looking to, in building a culture of care, we can just look to, so many communities that already do this. Black communities in America, indigenous communities, immigrant communities, queer communities who teach us that family is also chosen, the disabled community that show us that care is collective and that we are interdependent. And so this kind of collective care and these cultures of care do already exist in our world and in this country across different communities, but our policy doesn't reflect that. And so we need to work towards policy that reflects that shared vision and value of what it actually means to thrive, and expand our ideas of what family is, what community is, and what care is. Because care happens across the lifespan, and it's, again, the most universal thing we do.
I can see this leading to a conversation about the base and superstructure of capitalism. But we don't have enough time.
We do not.
We don't have enough time.
I'd be happy to have that conversation, but we do not have the time.
We don't have enough time left for that this evening, but I do think we have enough time to show one more clip from Aftershock Wellness Center.
I was aware that this is a growing epidemic
Yes.
in our communities, and that is so upsetting to me. An alarm has to be sounded about this.
I never thought that this would happen to my family.
Yes.
Because I do reproductive justice
Right.
work. But, you know, just also, why wouldn't it? We're black and brown.
Right.
You know, she's a woman, she was having a baby, so why would we think we would be exempt because we have the knowledge? Knowledge doesn't save you from this
right.
epidemic.
Right.
Omari, I can't speak for you, but I'm mourning growing old with my daughter.
Yeah, definitely.
We were 20 years apart, and the women in my family live a long time, so I anticipated being 90 and her being 70 and getting on each other's nerves in that space, you know. So mourning what could have been is also very real.
I definitely want to partner with fathers who specifically have suffered loss the way I have, and to get fathers together to just really talk about how after, you know, you lose somebody important, how the community helps.
If it's possible to have this space be one of the hubs where men gather and have these conversations, I especially want it for black men because it's a desert out there in reference to support.
You know, this is not something that is just specific to me or specific to just a handful of people. Like hundreds and thousands of men are going through this same, you know, scenario and situation.
Omari, what are some of the ways you're creating tools, spaces, resources where men engage on such topics from what we just saw in this clip?
Yeah, definitely. So I think this clip is a really strong representation of what Aftershock is. You know, losing somebody who's so important to your family is one thing, but there is definitely a ripple effect, you know, and it's a loss to the community, and it affects everybody for years, for decades to come. So, you know, with that said, and it affects us in a negative way, but it can also affect us in a positive way. So, like, I often say that, you know, I've achieved from my deepest grief, I've achieved my greatest growth. And it's only because of the fact that I had to learn how to navigate dark places. And when you navigate dark places, you don't know where you're going, right? Until you turn the light on and you realize, you know, if you're in movement and if you're trying to shift energy, you realize that you're in a space in which you would probably never be if you knew what the path was, possibly. So I say all of that to say, for our foundation, the ARIA Foundation, it stands for the Advancement of Reproductive Innovation through Artistry and Healing. So with that, what we're really looking to do is see how we can teach an infant from adult not just what language is, but what grief is, what loss is, what trauma is, but also what ancestral communication is, what partnership looks like, what fatherhood looks like. So what we're doing, so there's a couple of things that the ARIA Foundation is. One is we're really focusing on postpartum, because with maternal mortality, most of the deaths happen the day to a year after your partner has given birth. So we're creating a postpartum awareness week that goes along with the Black Maternal Health Week. That's going to be in May of 2020. May of 2023 is going to be our inaugural week. And in that week, we'll be having 7 days of workshops, information, and community engagement centered around postpartum. But I'm also creating a children's book. And the children's book is essentially, because when, like Gary was saying, when he was out in the world looking, sorry, Brian. So Brian was saying he was out in the world looking for information, there wasn't none. So when Shamani passed away and I was looking for a way to have conversation with my children about what happened to her, and I could find hardly anything. And I definitely found nothing with a Black and brown face on it. So what my book is going to be is centered around not just loss, but how you can continuously create a relationship on this ancestral plane with the physical plane, and how you can continue to grow that relationship and foster that relationship. Because I don't know how many of you saw the film. I'm not sure how many of you saw the film, but in the film, I created a piece of artwork that is in Anari's bedroom. And it was during COVID time, so she had daycare on Zoom. And she created a piece of art. And, she went and showed her mother, and they had a conversation around it. Like, Shamani said, "Oh, that's beautiful." It came out of Anari's voice, but this is Shamani having a conversation with her. And Anari's like, "Thank you, Mommy," and then she comes back, and it's just a small representation and understanding that, even though the relationship is different, it can never be unbounded, right? It can only be fostered. So that's one. Another thing is also the Luxor Collective I've created. So what the Luxor Collective is basically a group where I talk to men specifically who have suffered loss the same way that I have and hold space for just conversation. And, to Kenneth, we all do it, but on Kenneth's iPad, he has Brotherhood is Fatherhood. And it's essentially that. What I've learned, though, very, very quickly in creating this collective is that men want to join because we all deal with trauma. All our traumas look differently, but we all need a space to talk about it. And we all need a space to talk about it and be vulnerable and understand that it stays in the space, understand that, through our communication and through our grief, we are all looking to become stronger people, right? So it is, like I said earlier, just kind of creating the platforms in order to have these discussions and dialogues. And then lastly, we're always advocating for policy change to happen. Me personally, I'm not super big into politics, but holding space and being an advocate to tell people what to do and how to do it in order, and what the proposed policies that are on the table are something that I take upon myself to do. And of course, the art, creating art and, through our foundation. The In Her Honor series is, of course, going to be an ongoing series to help tell these stories. But what I'm really looking to do now is put it into spaces and places where the dialogue can be had, such as the space here that Equimundo provided, but working with museums and other entities of that nature in order to bring in conversations that we don't necessarily have seen before, but using art as a conduit to have the dialogue.
Ladies and gentlemen, Omari Maynard, Araya Foundation. Aria Foundation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hector Sanchez Flores, National Compadres Network. Sarah Vitti, Care Across Generations. Kenneth Braswell, Fathers Incorporated. Diane Anderson, Fathering Together. All I can say is, where were these people 40 years ago when I really needed you? But I did have a predominantly low-income community that helped me to raise my children and underscored the importance of community. They were raised by that community.
Yes.
Your turn, sir.
Kojo Namdi. So thank you so much, Kojo, for for your great moderation. We definitely need you back on the air 5 days a week, right? So everyone, thanks so much for coming. Real quick, I know that Equimundo would like to thank P&G and the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation for their support of this work and for their staff who have made tonight possible. Please check out Equimundo's landscape study, Who Cares About America's Male Caregivers? And that's available for download at the equimundo.org website. You can watch Aftershock, which is streaming on Hulu. Consider hosting a screening in your community. Omari, I'm hoping that you're working with the Brooklyn Public Library, which I caught a real quick snapshot of, my home. And I know that they're doing some great work, actually, with incarcerated fathers and their children and literacy. So maybe a good connection I can help you with there. With that, I want to thank my team, Ryan Williams, for coordinating everything here, and our communication staff. And don't forget, if you've got a moment, you can tell your story. We've heard a lot about stories. There's a booth outside on the 5th floor, so we've got a few minutes before we close. So please do that. Thanks again for coming, and enjoy your holidays.